Ciarán, thanks for being with me today. I'm always happy when I get to talk to a friend joining us here on an N of One. You know, so much of our time as social psychologists and sort of applied behavioral scientists in the world, we talk about the masses, right? The group, the things that are true across large numbers. But individual stories matter. And so this is my chance to talk about your individual story. So thanks so much for being with me today. I appreciate it.
Of course, happy to be here.
So, you know the format. We start at the beginning. So I want to hear about young Ciarán. Like, you know, give me a picture here. You know, 7, 8, 9. Like, if I'd asked 8-year-old Ciarán, what are you going to do? What did you think was the future?
I think at 7, 8, 9, I still held on to that dream that many young kind of sporty people have, is that, you know, I'm going to have a career as a, you know, from Ireland, it's like the career that there's lots of sports, but the career is soccer, right? You go to, you know, you play locally, you get seen and you get scouted and you get taken over to England where the big leagues are. And then that's where you end up. And I thought, like, that's the dream. It's like play. That's exciting. You get to play for a career. And I'm not getting too ahead of myself, but probably like a year or two after that was the realization that, like, oh no, I'm not one of those. I'm not one of those that's going to get plucked. So it's like, it's fine. My son just turned 13, and that's kind of like, you start to see that realization of, like, you know, the childhood dreams of who you think you're going to be, and then the reality of what it is. But it was play. It was like, I just wanted to have like a job that ended up being something that I enjoyed. So I quickly pivoted probably, and again, we can probably get into that, but I was like, well, if I'm not going to be, you know, there's always a chance, but I'm probably not going to get paid to play. So what's the next thing I can do? And that was, you know, I want to coach, I want to teach, and you look at what's available around you. And I grew up in Northwest Ireland. You know, my parents didn't go to college. It wasn't really, you know, there was only a certain number of jobs. So I enjoy when I hear people and they say, oh, I saw this person. I was like, those people weren't really in my, you know, there was a doctor and there was maybe a lawyer, but there weren't so many, you know, there were no BeSci jobs or I saw.
You're trying to tell me that local, like, yeah, early 80s Northwest Ireland wasn't just lousy with applied behavioral scientists just running around doing things? No, not so much.
Yeah, well, like, not in that name, right? We look back and we say, oh wow, that's applied behavioral science, or this is applied behavioral science, and we did that without knowing. And I think something that's, you know, that we'll touch on again is like community, right? So community and that bondedness and my work, and I've always had this exercise focus, and I think even from then it was, I think how my career has been is like, well, it started off exercise. It's like, well, how could I be better? What are those elements that I could change within myself to be better as an athlete, as a student? And that stayed with me throughout. It's like, well, how do we get people to do things? Like, maybe something comes easy to me, but not to another. So what are those mechanisms? So I didn't use the word mechanisms back then, but you know, you think about it. But yeah, the job that was in front of me quickly at like 7, 8, 9, 10, I was like, I'm going to be a phys ed teacher, because it was, you know, it's a fun job. You got to coach teams. It's kind of a little different than it is in the US, but you were both the teacher, but you were also the college, you know, the high school coach for the soccer team or for the local club. And that really excited me, because those were jobs and those were people that I looked up to. And I thought, oh, that's who I want to be when I grow up. So.
And did that carry through as you went? I know you went to Ulster. Like, did that carry through as you went into college? Like, were you like, okay, I'm going to go to college and then I'm going to come out and be, you know, the phys ed teacher coach kind of route?
Yeah, it's like as linear as it was. I put up a sign. It's kind of funny, like, to do phys ed in Ireland, to get into one of the colleges. There were really two colleges. There was one in what was University of Ulster at the time. Now it's called Ulster University, outside of Belfast. And there was also a program in Limerick, and those were the two programs really. And they were as hard as almost any other course to get into. So I knew from like whatever going into high school at 12, like we don't have middle school, so I got into high school at 12, and I knew what the grades were, and I had to get those grades. So I played sports, did my thing, but I was very aware that these were the grades. And it's funny, I went all the way through, and then I got to this point where I got really good grades in my leaving certificate, which is equivalent of, so like here, not the same, right? But I know in England, you've got A levels, Ireland, you have leaving cert. So I got really good grades. And then someone said to me, they're like, oh, well, now that you got those grades, why don't you go and do something like
something else?
like good, something else, like go to be a doctor or go to be a lawyer. And I was like, well, that's not what I thought of. What I did consider for a time was going and doing history. And it's funny, it's this theme I've heard. I haven't listened to all of them, but like there's a theme where history and sociology, psychology wasn't even on my radar and that, right? So even psychology wasn't a thing because it was just this out there, but history, why people did things. And then my undergraduate was sport and exercise science, which was pretty broad, but really was a vehicle to get majority of people into phys ed teaching, which was a postgrad. So I did that, but I loved the sociology. We had this amazing professor came over, a visiting professor from England, who was an expert in hooliganism. And he was like, why do people do these things? They say they love sport, but you have these group dynamics. So, and then the problem is we had sports psychology, but the sports psychology that we learned was really just very performance visualization and these kind of mental elements. So it wasn't really broad scope. It wasn't behaviors.
Yeah, it was
the sociology was behaviors. The
clinical. Yeah, got it. It's interesting that you mentioned hooliganism, right? Because if you look at, social psychology in the US, so much of it comes as a reaction to Nazism, right? And trying to understand why people do really weird, fucked up things, right? Or things that don't from the outside seem to make a bunch of sense. It's interesting that your crash course in psychology was like hooliganism. I love that. And so you're at Ulster, you're like studying. Do you still kind of think that you've got great grades. Do you still kind of think you're going back and becoming a phys ed teacher and coaching?
Yeah, like that's what I loved at that time. It's why my first intro just, I'm in Southern California now, many, many moons later. But I went into college during the summers. I coached. So I coached a sport called Gaelic football in Ireland. I coached soccer. I ended up in Orange County coaching soccer to American kids. And I was like, my friends were, laying bricks and working in bars and that, which I did too at different times. But I was like, it's a pretty easy job. And I did that. I did my undergrad. My undergrad wasn't necessarily had this relationship with, I've been to college. I spent a lot of time in college. Mm-hmm. Some of it's been good. Some of it's been like, was it worth it? But it wasn't the groundbreaking thing that I thought. And I did that. I immediately went and did a postgrad in Liverpool in education, which was my P qualification. You needed a year qualification. And then I taught for a year, and pretty quickly I was like, this is not what I thought it would be when I was 12. And I'm 21, right? Or 21, 22.
Explore that for a second. Like what about that year of teaching? As a guy who I got a teaching degree knowing I was never going to teach, right? Knowing that along my journey I would be teaching and I wanted to be better at it, but knowing I didn't want to be professionally employed as a teacher. What about that year taught you, hey, this is maybe not the path for me?
I think I've had a love-hate relationship with teaching and coaching from the get-go, because I think I relate well to people in small groups, but I get frustrated at the lack of the inability to touch more a wider audience and to really kind of lay down what I've learned over time. And I think from there I did it, and I was like, only so many of these kids really, as now the research more recent, it's like this, there's not a homogenous response to my teaching. Some kids are like, oh my God, he was amazing, he inspired me. And other kids are like, the guy sucks.
This is one kid,
I worked in Northern Ireland. Yeah. One kid, did, offer to petrol bomb my car. That was one of my first year of teaching. So that's a very Northern Ireland thing. He didn't do it, but he did offer in class to do that. This is a PE teacher, right? I'm not even like the math teacher or someone you would expect. I'm the phys ed teacher, so I'm the best of the bunch. But yeah, teaching wild kids to throw a javelin and in the pouring rain and to do this, I was like, my mind was just expanding, right? I wanted to give more, and I at that point I realized that I probably wanted to go into. I still felt teaching goes back again. What are the jobs that are in front of you? The jobs that were around me were like, well, I saw the university professors at my undergrad and my postgrad, and I was like, I could do that. I can teach. I can teach the teachers. I was already doing coach education and my part-time, so I was coaching younger coaches. I was doing my work then was very much athlete focused. It was very performance. I was working with one of my, I'd started a small, kind of side hustle of doing analysis on athletes. So, but I was very much about at the time, I was very much about the how of exercise and outcomes versus the why. I don't know if that's maybe the right term, but it was less about why do people exercise. And I was like, if you do this exercise, how does this respond in terms of your training? So that would have been my undergraduate dissertation was about really kind of analyzing intensity of exercise. So really getting into the nitty gritty of training analysis and so on. And then worked for a year and did that thing where, I felt like I'd been working long enough. So I got a 1-year contract out of college, but I really wanted to travel, as is a done thing by a lot of, I guess, Europeans and non-Americans probably all over. And I wanted to hit Australia and do all those things. So I did my undergraduate straight to postgrad for a year, worked for a year, and then lined up this year-long round the world trip that, was not very career minded, but was really, I think, the making of me in terms of just like what it was a lot of growing up that time. So.
And what did you think was going to happen after that year? So you go on this vision quest. You go to Australia, you go around the world, you do these things. You're coaching coaches, you're doing a trainer. You're like, you have a little bit of this and a little bit of that going on. And then you thought, and then I'll come back to Ireland and go back to teaching, or hopefully this vision quest will show me what's next, or like, how does
No, I was pretty much, I'll go back to teaching. I'll go back and get into that, I'll do my master. So then progression was probably master's to be a university professor. And I was like, I was already kind of working with some of the university professors in that coaching. So I worked for the Gaelic Athletic Association, doing some coaching seminars for the coaches. And I was like, I like this because it feels like I was working with people who were interested. And this is also a thing that I've had a love-hate relationship with, is working with people who are really dedicated and then working with people who just don't care, right? It's like, we think of trans-theoretical model of change. There's like, there's like the action, and then there's like, they're not even contemplation. They rail against it, but that's a challenge. But at that time, I was very much like, I'm going to work with a lot of athletes. I'm going to be high performance coaching and that in Northern Ireland. And I went back, got a job there in I guess like a equivalent here of a junior college, or a kind of like, not like that research one type college, with the intention that I would work there and move from there, and loved it, absolutely loved it. Because I was coaching the teams. I had my own exercise lab. So I was doing exercise testing, analysis, doing all of that. And it was epic. And, but at the same time, at the end of my round the world trip, I met this, young American woman who 20 plus years later is I guess the reason I'm here in Southern California. So I met her. So we were dating long distance, and yeah, we had this thing. So, one of my friends, I thought I had the dream job. I thought I had it lined up in Ireland, but there's one of my good Irish friends who, in a classic Irish way, is like, are you like, I'm trying not to speak too local Irish, but he's like, what's wrong? Like, what's wrong with you? Like, move to the States, take on that life that people aspire to. And this is like, we're in the armpit of the world, which I love Ireland. So he's just messing with me, but like, he goes, why would you not go? And she was living in Miami at the time. And he was, why do you not go there? So, so I left what I thought was so I was really on my dream trajectory, I thought. In retrospect, it wasn't, but at the time I thought it was. Had bought a house and done all the things and
Talk
living this life. So
talk to me about that for a second. You said in retrospect it wasn't. Where do you think you would have gotten dissatisfied over time had you continued to do it? So you go down that fork a longer way. Do you think you would have got tired of the
well,
train the trainer model? Do you think you like what is it about that makes you go, ah, it's not the right?
I think I've stayed in jobs a relatively long period of time, but I think I ultimately question. I just question where I am and where I've been. So I think I've always been destined to kind of pivot and question where I am and the setup that I am and and even with academia, I have a bit of a love here, and I'm in exercise, and I've been broad scope exercise science and behavioral science, but especially in the teaching. And sometimes I'm like, what sort of path are we putting these young people on? Is this the path that they need to
Mhm.
be on, or are we burdening them with careers that are not necessarily? So part of me felt like I needed to expand. So I would have evolved there was room within Northern Ireland and Ireland to evolve and to do more. And I see colleagues who've done remarkable things, but in that institution that I was in, it would have gotten small quite quickly. And I think coming to the US really challenged me. Leaving Donegal to go to Belfast, to go to Northern Ireland challenged me in that, there's this, going into just a bigger pool of people and more talented people. And when I came to Florida initially and then to New York, we were only in Florida for a brief time, but coming to New York was just kind of mind blowing because just everybody was so accomplished and it's just like they were just brilliant. And that was, I felt like that was really great for me because it really pushed me to be better, to critically analyze where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And also I guess it was a change model where the performance that there was a very, it's changing here in the US, but in Europe at the time, there was a very scientific model around athletes and athletic performance. Whereas here I felt it was maybe a bit of a generalization, but it was very much the strength and conditioning coach kind of did everything. So it was more just about a volume based approach. There wasn't as much science. Definitely changing. There's sports science everywhere now. But this is 2006, and it really wasn't the same, and it was hard to break in. So at that time, I went back, did my master's, and then started looking much more at a kind of slightly different. I took a bit of a turn. It felt like a pretty natural turn, but started taking. That's when my career started turning away from athletic performance into more kind of population insight. I still, in my work, I still worked one on one. I still worked in small groups, but I was kind of starting to work towards that broader. How do you really help lots of people and started really looking at technology. So my master's, there was a lot of work in accelerometry as it was coming out. So how can we use these devices to get population insights and then potentially deliver? But it was really population insights first before it became behavioral insights. But that led on to my doctorate, which is my doctorate was really, I was like, I think these wearables are going to be a major factor in my in sorry not my in how we assess people's behaviors and potentially impact them. And this is maybe my memory versus others, but I remember my doctoral advisor being, these are just a gimmick. This is not the way to go. And I was like, well, I don't necessarily think so. And it's not I don't want to say I told you so because it wasn't. And it's funny. I heard you say, and other people say that someone advised you against doing your doctorate or going this path. And I realized I was told like many, many, many times, I don't know if this is a place for you or this place for you. And I just kind of put my head down and just
Did it anyway.
barreled through for better or worse. So, and has it worked out? It's like, I'm not so revisionist. Even coming on here is weird being revisionist because I don't look back oftentimes because I'm like, this is a path. The path is a kind of a windy, as much as mine doesn't always seem that windy. I wanted to be involved in helping people get from exercise and physical activity what I've gotten, which I feel is, relatively good health most of the time. social connectedness and so on. So I think that's always been the thing for me, is like, well, why don't people do what I did? And I've broadened my understanding of why, which is good. Because sometimes exercise researchers don't. They're like, why don't you just exercise? Because it's amazing. But there's a whole world out there that's not. But that's often a tangent.
No, but I actually think that that's a core piece, because that is part of your journey, right? You go from this place of like when you're at Long Island University and you're getting your master's in exercise physiology, and which is, to your point, much more about the like science and mechanics of like, if you do this, that it's a very cause effect sort of thing, right? If you want to build X muscle, you do X thing and X muscle gets built, and like that's the thing. And then you do decide, hey, I'm going to take on this more applied psychology, applied physiology, like a much more applied bent, a much more change oriented bent. So I want to zoom in on that a little bit, because I think, to your point, that is a pivot when you start going to, and you tied it to wearables. And I love, by the way, that, you're fighting the tendency to be revisionist, but it is important to remember that, I mean, the world has gone your way. Wearables have turned out to be a fairly big deal. It is interesting to remember that there were a whole bunch of people going, this will never catch on, right? Like that nobody cares, nobody wants to know, right? In our minds, at this point, looking back, we just think Fitbit is a ubiquitous truth that was always true and was always going to be true. But that's not at all clear. It's not at all clear that like it was going to make it. It wasn't at all clear that people were going to want to do this thing. And there have been plenty of dead bodies along the road, right? There have been plenty of wearables that didn't work, right? And attempts that didn't make it. What do you think that, try and take yourself back there. What do you think that you saw as a, sort of an expert in physiology that made you go, hey, there's something about the psychology of this device that's going to make a big difference here?
So I think I railed against psychology a little bit because I just felt like it was a soft science. And I felt like for us to move forward, we needed really hard metrics on exercise and physical activity. So I think my primary thing was like, we needed good numbers, we needed foundations. And we needed foundations. So we needed foundational data. I probably softened a little bit in that, but I was like, I want to know what Matt's activity is now. I want to know what his sleep is. I want to know maybe what his VO2 is, what his 1 rep max is, and so on, right? So that was my physiologist really coming through. So it came from this place of measurement. And at the same time, so I did my doctorate part-time. I worked in a small, it was a fitness, a really innovative, it's called the Center for Preventative Medicine. So it was called La Palestra, boutique gym stroke wellness center that we're actually seeing lots of now, but it was very much ahead of its time. My boss was, continues to be, it's still there, this, really forward-thinking guy. And I was there as an expert in exercise and physiology. And I was there to oversee the exercise testing, but also kind of explain what our findings to both our trainers so they could train our clientele, but also to our physician staff and that. So people would come in and get an evaluation with a psychologist and a nutritionist and doctor. So it was a wonderful model. I'll fast forward. It hasn't scaled in the way that I needed it to do, or I wanted to do, and that is, I feel like in a lot of my jobs, I get to be a purist in terms of science. My boss was like maybe more of a realist in terms of, the financial aspect of it. But that's ultimately probably why I left there, because I was like, this has to scale. We need to be able to cater to not just the CEOs and the very wealthy and the, whatever celebrity or this who just have endless money. But that has very much alongside my academic thing, working with people like that has very much kind of molded my thought process. So my point being there is, when I was able to one-on-one work with somebody, I knew everything about them. So I had all of the data. So I was able to tweak the everything. I knew when they, what nights they went out for drinks. I knew their kids' names. I knew all of the things. So I had this but it was all in my head, or it was all written on paper. So for me, at the same time I'm working this, I'm like, oh wow. And before, my first study was using the Nike Fuel Band, which I still have one. I feel I kept it because that was the device at the time. So big and bulky. And I have a whole, I'm not the only one, I'm sure anyone in wearables has like the old devices that they've held on to, because it's just memories, right, over the time. But I was like, oh, we can get a lot of the data at the time similar data, it's got a huge margin of error to begin with. That's getting less and less. And that was throughout my time. It was getting better and better. But I was like, oh, if we give this to these other people who are not able to spend X thousands per year to have someone like me be their personal advisor, it doesn't that like that. There's a path. Yeah. And I really felt like I was a person, and I continue to feel, and there's many more people than me now. At that time, I was both really interested in that metrics and then how that related to their outcomes and so on. And as I grew, I was like, became when I started with my doctorate, it was probably more in that measurement, a little bit more the performance. And then I turned towards the end as I looked towards my dissertation. I wanted to see, well, my dissertation was basically who are wearable users and how do they use these devices? And I guess I'll get cut to the end. Like people mostly love them, but there was also this, again, there's not a homogeneous response. Some people love it, some people it doesn't have any effect, and some people it has a detrimental effect. And that was, that was something that came out of it. That was, I don't have any wearables on me right now. It's not necessarily something that I think I advise for every person. I think overall, yes, data is better, but I still think, I'll jump forward a little bit. I started thinking that as an academic. So I went back into, after I finished my doctorate, I was looking at, and I was still at La Palestra, but I was kind of coming towards the end of that because I felt like I needed to kind of go bigger. We needed to have broader scope, or I needed to. So I'd been doing a little bit of teaching again. I was like, oh, do I go back into teaching? I was at Brooklyn College. I was like, this is great. I was really helping students who were from all over the world who needed mentorship to kind of raise up. But I was also then looking at, well, like, this is, how do I do all of the things? So from there, one of my kind of colleagues at the time was at Columbia Medical Center, which is separate to where we were at Columbia. And they were like, listen, we're doing all this really interesting work in wearables. Maybe you would consider coming back and doing a postdoc here. And I'm not that young. So I was like, I don't know if I want to go back to a post. My wife has supported me throughout this, right? But like being a postdoc in New York is it's not really like the big money job that pays the rent. So questionable decision, but gave me more. It was a Center for Behavioral Cardiovascular Health. It was very much behavior change. And I was like, oh, this is what I've been doing all along. And it was primarily psychologists. My initial boss was this amazing, wonderful researcher named Karina Davidson, who then was kind of in the process of moving to Northwell Health, but she was there and had this great team of physicians. And I worked with a guy named Keith Diaz, who continues to do amazing work in sedentary behavior and other exercise. So it was a really good training for me. I was like, okay, well, here's how I can get my reach.
And so you come into this environment, it's got a more of a behavioral bent, but also helps you realize, hey, maybe I've been doing this all along. Did it feel like a natural fit with your psychologist colleagues from the beginning? Or to the extent, where it rubbed, where did it rub, right? Were there things that you saw differently than how they saw that made it more difficult to collaborate, right? Because so much of being an applied behavioral scientist, you can't do it alone, right? It requires interface. Like it doesn't succeed unless you can get operations people and executive folks and other people on board. Did you, when you sort of crash landed there, did you feel like, oh yeah, like these are my people and it's all gelling, or was there an adjustment period?
I didn't gel. I just didn't feel like it was the right fit. I felt like the people were great. They had a pretty clear mission on where they were going. It just was. It wasn't the thing. It wasn't the thing. It was, Columbia was too academically kind of like narrow for where I needed to be, and I think I was a little too old to go there as a postdoc. Keith was great. I loved elements of it where we just had these like kind of like ideas ideation, and we say, let's do this and do that. And I felt like that was really good for me. But in a different world, I probably would have been there 10 years younger and been able to put in the time to do all the, get my K and do these different grant mechanisms that were just running out of time a little bit. And that's where I've tried more recently. I'm like, the path to being a really good, really not good, that's not the right word, successful academic starts very, very early. It really starts at your undergrad, into your master's. You need to be getting your name on enough stuff. So I was playing catch up, and that was forcing me into this very narrow track. And my skill set has never been a narrow track. My skill set is that I've coached, I've taught, I've managed a bunch of people. Like when I was at La Palestra, I ended up like managing tons and tons of people. And I've got this very broad scope skill set. For me to be successful at Columbia, I needed to go really narrow. And that just wasn't the right fit. It was very educational for me at the time to work in a very, very extremely successful. Everybody there was just like unbelievably smart and brilliant. But it just wasn't the right fit at the right time. But I was like, maybe I could have tried to slog it out, but I've never been one to say, I did it for my doctorate. I was like, I'm not going to do this again. I'm not going to just slog because of it. And an opportunity came up at Northwell Health, also in New York. So I didn't, I'm also have been very reluctant to move because of family and everything else. So Northwell came up and I moved there, and it was kind of everything that and when it was everything that I wanted during the interview process. And because it was going to give me this broader scope to touch many, many different aspects of behavioral science, physical activity, and monitoring, and so on. And then I guess the only pivot there is my first day was March 16th, 2020, which was the first day of COVID lockdown, which really changed how the rest of the experience would be in many, many ways. So I guess that's probably a good point to stop for a second and see if there's anything prior that you want to touch
so I
on.
love this. So this is really, so you talked about, hey, this really in the interview felt like it fit. One of the things that comes up for people all the time is, it is a transition going from academia into more of the private sector. How did you decide that was something you wanted? How did you decide that that was something you were interested in, comfortable with? And then how did you convince them that you were going to be a good fit, right? Despite not necessarily having a huge business background.
Well, I will say, so Northwell, I was working for the Feinstein Institute, which is the academic arm of Northwell. So it was still research academia. I did look at going fully outside of academia because I didn't feel, in general, I've been caught between these two different things where I've been in academia a lot of the time. I don't always think my skill set is a very academic skill set, but it's worked well because, especially in these teams, like at Columbia, there's a team. So you have the very, very strict academics. Then you have the non, which was me, right? Non. And Northwell was the same. So Northwell was still academic, very similar in many ways to Columbia, but it was less rigid in the way it operated. It was more like a little bit of a startup. And what was exciting for me is that there were opportunities to work. So at Northwell, there's Feinstein, which is the academic arm, but then there's also Northwell Hospital, which has a massive, like 80,000 employees. So I was going to be working with employee wellness, which I did a lot of work with and had just great relations with them. I was working with the clinicians. I was working across. So it was really Karina now, who is my new boss, had been at Columbia, had moved to Northwell, was building this team. She was like, you don't have to really go after these NIH grants because that's not necessarily your skill set. We have other people who are better aligned with that track. She goes, I want you to go out and be an advocate for behavioral science, for our team across Northwell. And that was awesome because I've never been so comfortable with sales, but when you're selling science, like real science that you stand by, and that's always been a struggle for me. Like there's jobs I don't know if I've been offered them, but I'm like, oh, you could go and work here. I'm like, but I don't know if I can stand behind it. And people are like, it's a lot of money. And I was like, but I can't say that I believe in this if I don't believe in it, which is a fault, to be seen in my bank account. But ultimately, I could stand behind it. And Northwell was, there was still elements of it was academia that I struggle with. You know, there's times where I still was trying to write R01s and I'm stuck in a room by myself that I don't like. I'm a social person and I want to do those other things, but you know, I also I needed to write papers. I need to get my publications out. I need to do all those. And that was a really, between Columbia and Northwell, I was able to really elevate those numbers, but nobody reads those really. And they get you to a certain point. But the part of Northwell that I loved was that, you know, we got really hit very hard by COVID, but we were thinking, well, how can we support our frontline workers, our patient population? How can we support a broader scope? So the work that we did was really, really interesting there. And you know, the major project that I worked on was with Fitbit and then Google on their COVID detection algorithm, which was just, it was so much, I don't want to call it fun, but it was so stimulating because it was so fast, so much faster than standard academic work. And was a real huge education for me in trying to stand up a major, you know, multi-million-dollar project with so many different moving parts, with an industry partner who doesn't have the same has the same goals, but doesn't do things the same way as we do in academia, and trying to work together on that. So
Yeah, and so it's interesting, right? Because in some ways you go from being the most applied in the room of academics to being the most academic in a room full of business people who are like, you know, it's all about speed and it's all, you know, there's no science to it. It's just applied, 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 applied. Was that, did you feel that keen difference as you know, as you went through those? In some ways it makes you very successful, right? Because, you know, if you take the most academic from an academic environment and then you put them in an applied environment, it's going to be total organ rejection, right? Like they just, you know, they can't do it. But because you were the most applied person in the academic room, right? You're the most, let's do something, let's be forward, let's be aggressive on it. Did you find, what was it like to work with Google and Fitbit as an academic? How did you convince them that you were action oriented? How did you communicate to them that you were ready to move out of this academic sphere?
you know, I think that is such a great question. And I think it's really defined the last, like, whatever, that was 2020. It's kind of defined the last 5 years since to that point. Is like, people are like, well, what are you? Are you an academic? Are you not an academic? And then, because being an academic scares people off.
Yeah.
They just hear it and they're like, you're academic? No. And that happened to me. And I'll get back to your point in a second. That happened to me. We did another project with Apple and I got kicked off. Like, I have this, I was like, I got kicked off the meetings. And I was like, why did I get kicked off the meetings? And it was someone within my group, someone on our side, not on the Apple side, was like, a clinician who was like, academics slow things down. And I was like, I am here to offer this. I'm like, I'm here to offer support. I'm like, I'm on your side. And I got back on eventually but I had to resell myself to this person being like, hey, I'm not the enemy. Science is not the enemy. Right. It's like, it's like, we hear this, right? Is science, and this is a broad, like, right? Is science the enemy? No. And like, what do we mean by that? And then academics get tarred with this, oh, well, you're a scientist, you're an academic, so you're going to only cause roadblocks. So to go back to Google and Fitbit, it was like they needed someone who was more rigorously academic than them. So that they wanted an academic partner. So that was important for them. So that was our end. But they wanted a relationship with someone who they could talk to and they could have a relationship with. And I think I got very lucky that my counterpart at Fitbit, who's this guy Connor Heenahan, also Irish by chance, so that was part, maybe helped it. He's just really, really smart. He's a scientist. He's a sleep scientist, very brilliant, builds all these sleep algorithms and all the rest, but it was also aware that Northwell could offer him something that maybe other university partners couldn't. So they have their pick of university kind of collaborators, but Northwell was able to give them something that others couldn't, and potentially a level of rigor that others didn't really want to do either. So it worked out well. And you know, we never had a true, like, kind of retrospective of like, well, how happy were you with us or how happy were we with you? But but I think we worked really well together in a time that was very, it was just so volatile. You know, we were working, we put together this, again, it was like probably $2 to $3 million kind of project in a very short span of time without knowing that vaccines would come out or whatever else. And then we were the first hospital in the country, we were the first place in the country to get vaccines administered at the same time as we were trying to roll out a COVID detection algorithm. And we got pretty much shut down because the administrators were like, there is only one option, and that is vaccines. We are not going to let you roll out some sort of other potential kind of like way of checking for COVID because we have we have a singular message, and that is, I guess, behavioral science from the get-go. There's no no at Northwell. You get the vaccine or you don't, which I fully stand behind. And I was like, I had to go back and say, well, we're actually not saying anything different. So we had to change a lot of our messaging to be much more clear that this is not an alternative. So I had this, it was like, was it the most groundbreaking research ever? Well, no, it didn't end up being that way because COVID numbers came down, vaccines went up, we didn't get as many, the algorithm wasn't as tight as maybe it will be in a few years' time. But I think it was but that's how science is, that's how real academia is. Like we went in that early, the early 2000s, the media was saying that Apple Watch or a pick your wearable, they could detect COVID. And they couldn't tell you that you didn't have too many drinks last night. They could tell you something was off. But for me, that's not a failure. That's just like, we are advancing science. It's just not at the speed to get a product out the door that is FDA approved and all the rest. So for me, it was a very personally, a lot of learning, a lot of managing a team and managing outside vendors. And I learned a lot, and it was hard for everybody. We're home, we're in COVID. Like, luckily we're not, we felt very fortunate. We're not the frontline workers, but we had to build this very decentralized everything. We didn't do anything in person anymore. Even the lab testing and so on, like we were sending people to, sending clinicians, our techs to people's homes to get tested. The frontline workers were going in. We had to have so many protocols. So, and that was the Northwell team. The team at Northwell were just amazing. And I felt like, for us working with someone like Fitbit, and then as Google came in their part, it was really interesting for us to see how, we compare, and our team compared against this, giant of everything. And you have these ideas of who they are and what they are, and they're just like us. Celebrities they're just like us. So
yeah, I mean, I hear that completely, and I think you touched on a couple of really interesting themes in there. One of which I think is, the messaging. The science doesn't change, right? Science is science. Like, that's the beauty of it. I've always loved the point that, like, there's Armageddon, we wipe everything out, religion comes back different, science comes back exactly the same, right? Because gravity, we have abundant evidence for it, and so we will rediscover, even if we forget it, we will rediscover it, because that's the nature of sort of the scientific method. So, learning to craft that messaging, which you know so early from teaching, right? You've learned so early on, as you're teaching kids in Donegal to play soccer, right? Like, that's, at the end of the day, a huge part of being an applied behavioral scientist is still individually helping people understand why a particular behavior change program is worthwhile. And we forget that all the time. We think the hard part is finding the interventions. And that turns out to be not all that true, right? It's relatively easy to find scientifically backed ways to change people's behaviors that are net accretive. Mm-hmm. Doing it in a way that is like at an attractive cost benefit ratio that you can convince a stakeholder to roll out, that is much harder. I mean, I know you're still visiting at Feinstein, but you have done some research consulting. You start to, sort of work with a wider swath of people. How do you like consulting? Like, what does that scratch for you as an itch right? Do you think you'll go back in house at some point, and what will that look like for you? Tell me a little bit. We've talked all of us about this. You have such a great background. It's one of the things that I love about you and why I love it when we get to spend time together. Talk to me a little bit about the where this trajectory is heading for you and what's on your mind these days as you think about applied behavioral science.
Yeah, it's, I can't think of a better. It's kind of like midlife crisis-y. I'm like, oh, I moved from New York to California, for various reasons. Partly was like because you're here,
Naturally.
right? And others. But I moved because I felt like the whole journey of exercise into behavioral science is, well, if I can't listen to the messaging of behavioral science and be healthier and live this long life and feel better, then I can't apply it for others, right? So there's a little bit of that. So I'm like, part of me is like, well, who do I want to work for? How do I want to work? What does my lifestyle look like where I can do the things that keep me healthy, keep my family healthy, have not just be consumed. New York is amazing, the best city in the world, the best people. It's a very all-consuming place where you can be very much just like stuck in your work world, and that's your life. And part of being here was to have a more balance is not the word, rounded is not the word, but like a different way that speaks to all of these different competing factors.
As
So
as two people who are dads in Southern California, we can just say better. You can just say it's a better life. It is objectively, it's sunny. Your kids can run around outside. There's a lot going for San Diego.
if I say I don't even know where my wife is right now, but if I say that San Diego is better than New York, she will probably just
Hop
divorce
out
me
of the
on the
closet and conk you out.
um, but for me, it's part of it. I think in terms of the work, consulting offers me this ability to consult on a level that I'm good at. So people come to me when they need something like that I can speak to, which is this broad scope, definitely exercise, wearables, sleep behavior, like focusing on sometimes they don't know what they want. So it's nice that I can really, I've gotten to the point where I know enough about enough things that I can say, these things matter, these things don't, you should look at this. So I'm working on an app now with this great team in La Jolla, and we're looking at mental health and specifically bipolar. And it's kind of like it's an under researched population. It's a company called Mind Numbers who are just going to do great things. But it's like, what do we want to look at? Well, we want to look at this. And that's where I come in. I'm like, well, we should look at this now. And in a year's time, we should consider looking at this other metric and this other metric because they're not well established yet. So for that, I love that idea that I can go and offer people value. I think lots of us in our work want that. We want to say, can I offer something? I guess that was where at Columbia, to go all the way back there, I wasn't really a value add. So that was like, okay, well, if I'm not a value add, then
what am I doing here?
Our ways.
Yeah.
What am I doing here? Like, I'm not helping you. So what's the point there? And you're not helping me. So I'm that place. I think consulting, I'm not a super salesy, self-promoting salesy. So I don't love going out trying to drum up business. So I'll apply to in-house jobs here and there. And I'll be like, oh, that kind of intrigues me. So I'll go and I'll speak to somebody and I'll do that. So, I'm not opposed to going in-house, but I think it's very much like finding the right fit. And I think sometimes, and I think that's hard. It's a hard conversation to have sometimes. And I think more and more, and we don't have time to get into this, but in a world of AI, in a world of trying to just tick this narrowness, I don't always tick the right box, which is fine because people want somebody who's much more data scientist, or they think, well, I can get this from, someone who's an expert in AI. And I'm like, maybe you can. Who am I to say because I don't know what you're doing. So who am I to say that you do or don't? So I'm still waiting to see that in-house. I miss people, for sure. I miss people. I love being in a group where people are just bouncing ideas off each other, and then we work together. And I like a team around me. I don't need a team under me or anything like that. I love a team around because I have things that I know, but there's just so many things I don't know. And that's why I probably stayed at, I've been to 4 or 5 different universities through my career. because I just loved hearing other people's insights. And now I'm starting to say, well, you know what? I actually do have insights as well. And that's what this consulting is nice. I'm like, oh, you don't know that, and do this. So I think I'll continue to consult, continue to look at other things, and so much that it gives me time to coach a little bit. I try to coach a lot of the kids, which is nice. It brings me back to my roots, go and remain healthy and remain active, and do the things that I say I do. And then also the consulting gives me a little bit of time to try to think about what is the future, and how is something like AI going to, we see this, like, people are just generating behavioral science through AI. And I'm like, well, it's not quite right. There's elements of it are right, but unless it's one of those ones where it's like, if you don't know, then you can't see what's wrong. But if you do know, then you're like, it's just off. And it goes back to what you said, is we can build these interventions quite easily now. Say, take all what's there and build an intervention, but it doesn't speak to where the world is. And I think our populations are evolving as well in terms of how they respond to interventions and how they respond to technology. And that's probably where I've been working on a lot more recently as well, is that, I go back to, and this is a lot of what the work that we did at Northwell, and the work that Karina is very involved in, is N of one research. This podcast is N of one, so it aligns quite well, is that there's a very heterogeneous response, and we should be able to, in a world of AI, speak to every individual, but we just don't. And I don't think we're that close just yet, because even if we get all these different data sources, there's something missing. And that's where you need this human touch to try to guide that. So we've got a lot more tools. It's amazing the tools we have now. To go back to the foundations, we have this foundational understanding of people that we just wasn't even close to having even 10 years ago. So that's amazing, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's leave you on this then. Who do you think's doing it right? If you look at the sort of combination of wearables and exercise and physiology, and who do you think is, we've seen Fitbit be acquired by Google, and maybe more for their ability to actually ship hardware than anything else, right? Fitbit was never particularly good at the software piece. We've seen some devices emerge as dominant, or a Whoop, like, we've seen a couple of things, right? The Apple Watch still out there. Who do you think really is there a first mover competitor, last mover advantage for somebody? Or do you think, like, it's still a pretty wide open field and you haven't really seen the thing that you think is the silver bullet yet?
Yeah, I definitely haven't seen the silver bullet. Like, yeah. And whose fault is that? I think I'll go recite. There's this great researcher, San Diego, Eric Topol, and I was at a talk yesterday down at Scripps. Sorry, not UCSD, Scripps. So this talk yesterday, and he talked a little bit about longevity and about how there's these people pushing longevity and so on. And I think to get back to the point, I think a lot of the device companies are doing good things, but they're hawking devices, right? They're trying to get us to buy as many devices as possible. So I think I don't want to put all the blame on them, saying all they care about is getting devices sold and more devices and more market share. So, because I think they're getting better. I think 5 years ago I would have said that. I was like, you could do so much better. I think the device companies are starting to do better. I think the hospital systems and the in-between is lacking, and it continues to lack. That there's not enough people from the hospital systems. And I'm not saying that just us at Northwell were doing it, but we really tried to work with Fitbit to say, how can this work? Not just does it work, how could this work for our 80,000 employees? So if there's another pandemic, can we get you back in? And does the actual whole process work? Not just does it actually detect the algorithm, but can we apply it? It's applied technology. And I don't know that, I don't think there's enough. And this goes a little bit to the academics and the industry. Like, there's still a gap. They're getting closer together, but the device companies are using the academics to kind of get validation papers. the academics are using the device companies to, I don't know, maybe sometimes it's nice marketing to say there's relationships, but we're still not seeing broad scope physicians wearing, some of the projects we did was looking at burnout. So where are those in place where we're saying every physician is wearing a wearable? Doesn't have to be a particular brand, but that we actually see burnout in our physicians and we can track that and we can help them. And like, we kind of know that. So the work that we did with Fitbit has been done elsewhere. And again, to go back to it, COVID detection algorithm is not so much different than a burnout detection algorithm, different to a flu detection algorithm, right? It's like slight tweaks. But why are those things not in place? And I just think that there's just not necessarily enough kind of pressure on either side to make that jump. So I think people are trying it. Whoop is trying it a little bit more. Aura's trying it. Apple's trying it. Fitbit are trying it. They're all trying, but I'd love to see someone have just a better say, hey, we're going to go all in on this for like 5 years. We're going to put together a big grant. We're going to just really see if we can implement what we're saying to make real change, because despite all the wearables, we're not seeing massive changes in physical activity behaviors. Like, our population is not getting healthier.
Right.
And now we haven't gotten there, but now we have GLP-1s that are just saying, hey, you know what, forget about that whole exercise thing. Not necessarily, right? They're not saying that, but who's bringing all the different components together? And that's where everyone's just kind of looking out for themselves still. And we see that in other industries too, but I'd love to see a little bit more of this kind of roundtable. And I don't know, there's definitely organizations. I don't want to say it's not. There's organized dime societies trying to do it. There's other people trying to do it. I wish it was happening a little faster, but that means there's lots of work for us to do, right? Maybe that's part of our behavioral science thing, is how do we bring people together, these key stakeholders, to really reduce the barriers, right? Because you could say to any physician, oh, you wear an Oura ring, it's going to make you better. It's not, right? That was my research. It was like, you can't just give somebody a device and expect them to change. Handful of them will, but majority of them won't.
Right.
So what's that investment? So, so that was a conversation we had at Northwell all the time. Can we give 80,000 staff members, team members a device and that will improve their health? And I said, no. I was like, don't do it. Like, it's just not, it's not the answer. It's an answer. It's not the answer. So.
I love it. That's a great place to end this. I mean, your search for not just an answer, but the answer. I think, it is the number of Fitbits that have been sold worldwide is staggering to me, given the overall increase in obesity, right? Clearly, if this was going to work, it had worked already. There has to be something radically different. And instead we see iteration after iteration across different Apple releases the next Apple Watch with a slightly different sensor and a slightly different whatever. But where's that real quantum leap? It seems like that's still in the offing, and maybe AI is it, and maybe it's not. Kevin, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's always good to talk with you and to get your story. And I think I love that you're still, at least, I understand why consulting is lifestyle conducive and lets you coach and do all the things, but I love that you're still open to an in-house team, because you're such a great talent. You bring this nice combination of academia and industry. I feel anticipatory joy for the team that snatches you up. Thanks so much for spending some time on with it and telling your story. I appreciate it, buddy.
Thank you so much. Talk soon. Bye.
Yeah.